When David Carter dialed 911 on a warm summer evening, his voice was eerily calm. The dispatcher had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most shocking and tragic murders in recent Houston history. This wasn't just the story of a crime. It was the unraveling of a seemingly perfect marriage, a devastating act of violence, and the spark for a national reckoning on trust, identity, and intolerance. At the center of it all was Lena Moore, a beloved hairstylist whose life and truth collided with a secret that led to unimaginable consequences. David Carter and Lena Moore were the kind of couple that seemed to radiate happiness wherever they went. David, a 32-year-old construction worker, was well-liked in the community for his strong work ethic and easygoing personality. His calloused hands and sun-worn face were marks of a man who took pride in providing for those he loved. Lena, on the other hand, was a 28-year-old hairstylist with an eye for creativity and a talent that turned her clients into walking billboards for her skills. Her cheerful demeanor and sharp wit made her a favorite in the neighborhood salon, where laughter often filled the air when she was working. The two met at a local charity event, a fundraiser for underprivileged children in their Houston community. David, ever the gentleman, had volunteered to help set up tables and chairs, while Lena worked behind the scenes to coordinate gift bags. Their first encounter was almost cinematic. David held a door open for Lena, and she flashed him a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Within minutes, they were chatting like old friends, their connection immediate and undeniable. What followed was a whirlwind romance that swept everyone around them off their feet. Their love story became the kind that people whispered about at family gatherings, a beacon of hope in a world often clouded by cynicism. Friends and family admired their bond, and they quickly became known as the couple who had it all: charm, chemistry, and an unshakable foundation of love. When they married just a year later, their union was celebrated by everyone who knew them. The couple moved into a modest but cozy home in Houston, where they dreamed of building a future together. To outsiders, David and Lena embodied the dream of a perfect partnership, but the reality was far more complex than anyone could imagine. Beneath their picture-perfect exterior, a secret loomed, casting a shadow that would eventually consume them both. Lena Moore was no stranger to resilience. Her journey to live as her authentic self was a testament to her strength and determination. Born Liam Morgan, she had spent much of her early life grappling with an identity that didn't match the face she saw in the mirror. It wasn't until her early 20s that Lena finally found the courage to begin her transition, a path fraught with challenges, but also filled with moments of profound self-discovery. For Lena, transitioning wasn't just about outward appearances. It was about aligning her inner truth with the person the world saw. It meant enduring painful medical procedures, navigating societal prejudice, and perhaps most difficult of all, leaving behind a life she felt no longer belonged to her. Yet, through all the hardships, Lena emerged stronger, more confident, and determined to live unapologetically as the woman she always knew she was. When she met David Carter, Lena believed she had finally found her happily ever after. He was kind, hardworking, and made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced before. Their love blossomed quickly, and for the first time in years, Lena felt she could build a future without fear. But even as their relationship deepened, Lena struggled with whether to share her past. It wasn't that she didn't trust David. She feared how he might react to a truth that society so often demonized. She worried he might see her differently, or, worse, that her revelation might endanger the love they had built. Ultimately, Lena decided to keep her past a secret, not out of malice or deceit, but out of a deep-seated instinct for self-preservation. The choice weighed heavily on her, but Lena convinced herself it was the best path forward. "This is who I am now," she often thought. "The past doesn't change that." For years, she carried the burden alone, believing it was a chapter of her life that didn't need to be reopened. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when least expected, and Lena's was no exception. Her decision to stay silent would become the catalyst for a confrontation that neither she nor David could have imagined, setting the stage for a tragedy that would reverberate far beyond their own lives. The day David Carter discovered Lena's secret began like any other. a quiet morning marked by the mundane rhythms of life. But by the end of that day, their lives would be forever changed. While tidying up their shared closet, David stumbled across a weathered folder tucked behind a stack of old photo albums. Curiosity led him to open it, revealing documents that shattered the reality he thought he knew. Inside, he found Lena's birth certificate and medical records detailing her transition. The neat, clinical language on the pages painted a picture of a life before Lena had become the woman he loved. At first, David couldn't process what he was reading. His mind reeled as questions flooded in. How could she keep this from him? Why hadn't she trusted him enough to tell the truth? By the time Lena arrived home that evening, David's confusion had festered into anger. The confrontation was immediate and explosive. David, pacing the living room, clutched the folder in his hands as he demanded answers. His voice, usually calm and measured, was filled with betrayal and disbelief. Lena froze at the sight of the folder. She knew immediately what it meant and felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She had always feared this moment, but never imagined it would play out like this. Trying to steady her voice, she began to explain, her words laced with both fear and a desperate hope that David might understand. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid," she said, her voice trembling. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid of how you'd look at me." But her words fell on deaf ears. David's emotions had reached a boiling point, and he wasn't ready to listen. To him, it felt like his entire relationship had been a lie. The man who had always prided himself on being calm and rational now found himself overwhelmed by feelings he couldn't control. Hurt, anger, and betrayal swirling into a volatile mix. As the argument escalated, Lena tried to hold her ground, pleading for understanding and forgiveness. But David's rage was relentless, his voice growing louder, his accusations sharper. Each word seemed to push them further apart, breaking the fragile bond they had built. The room felt heavy, charged with an unbearable tension. By the time the confrontation reached its peak, the air between them was thick with unresolved pain and anger, leaving no room for compromise or reconciliation. This wasn't just a fight. It was the moment their love story began to unravel, setting the stage for an unspeakable tragedy. In the wake of the devastating confrontation, the night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the weight of their shattered trust hanging heavy in the air. David, consumed by a rage he could neither control nor understand, found himself spiraling deeper into a darkness he had never experienced. His thoughts were a blur of anger, betrayal, and confusion, emotions that had been quietly building beneath the surface for months, but which now exploded with brutal force. Lena, desperate to calm him, tried to de-escalate the situation, her voice soft, pleading for him to listen, to understand the fear and pain that had led her to keep her past hidden. But David's mind was no longer listening. He was drowning in the belief that the woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had deceived him in ways too deep to forgive. In a blind, uncontrollable rage, David seized the closest object he could find, a hammer. He swung it at Lena with force, the sound of impact cutting through the night air. Her scream filled the room, a chilling cry that pierced David's fury, but it didn't stop him. The hammer fell again and again, each blow fueled by the madness and confusion coursing through him. But the brutality didn't end there. In his frenzy, David grabbed a knife from the kitchen, his hands trembling as he turned on Lena once more. The violence escalated, each movement more frantic than the last. Lena, weakened and unable to defend herself, became the tragic victim of a crime that would soon send shockwaves through the entire community. When it was over, the silence in the room was deafening. Lena's body, unrecognizable and mutilated, lay lifeless on the floor, a grotesque testament to the ferocity of the attack. The once peaceful home they had shared was now a crime scene, stained by blood and violence. David stood over her, his breathing shallow, his mind still clouded by the rage that had consumed him. After several moments, he dialed 911. His voice was eerily calm, as if disconnected from the horrific act he had just committed. "I've hurt her. I need help," he said, his words devoid of emotion, as though he were speaking about someone else, someone distant. The dispatcher on the other end of the line could scarcely comprehend the gravity of the situation. It wasn't until the police arrived that the true horror of what had transpired became clear. Lena's body was found in a gruesome state, mutilated beyond recognition, the brutal nature of the crime stark against the backdrop of the life they had once shared. David was arrested on the spot, his actions leaving him no room for escape. The man who had once been known for his calm demeanor and hardworking nature was now a convicted murderer, facing the consequences of a crime that no one could fully understand or explain. The night of Lena's murder, once the authorities arrived at the scene, was filled with an overwhelming sense of disbelief. The police officers who entered the home were immediately struck by the gruesome sight before them. The scene was more than just a crime. It was an unraveling of everything that had once seemed normal. The body of Lena Moore was barely recognizable, her lifeless form cruelly disfigured by the brutal assault. The magnitude of the violence was immediately apparent, and it was clear that no act of self-defense or accident had caused such devastation. David Carter, standing in the middle of the living room, seemed almost detached from the horror surrounding him. His hands were bloodied, his face emotionless. When the officers approached him, he offered no resistance. The shock of the crime he had just committed had yet to fully settle in, but the reality of his arrest was undeniable. David was taken into custody without incident and charged with first-degree murder. His calm demeanor during the arrest was unsettling, as if he were simply a bystander to the chaos he had caused, rather than the perpetrator. As he was escorted into the back of the police car, he said little, his silence only adding to the growing mystery of what had pushed him to commit such a horrific act. The trial that followed was one of the most contentious and closely watched cases in Houston that year. It wasn't just a case of murder. It became a battle for the truth, a public spectacle that divided opinions and ignited debates across the nation. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution sought to paint David as a man who, driven by uncontrollable rage and betrayal, had carried out a savage act. They argued that while Lena's secret may have caused a temporary emotional disturbance, there was no excuse for the level of violence that followed. Witnesses testified to David's character before the crime. He had been a respected member of the community, hardworking, gentle, and mild-mannered. How could such a man, seemingly so well-adjusted, have committed such a brutal murder? It was a question that no one could easily answer, but the prosecution made it clear, no matter the emotional pain he may have felt upon learning Lena's secret, the crime he committed was not one of fleeting passion. It was premeditated and unrelenting in its brutality. The defense, on the other hand, argued that David's emotional distress was so profound that it left him unable to act rationally. They presented evidence of his mental state, including testimony from family and friends who spoke of the tension in the relationship leading up to the murder. They claimed that Lena's concealment of her past had been a betrayal too deep for David to process, and the anger that followed was an extreme, yet temporary emotional reaction to that betrayal. Throughout the trial, David sat stoically, his face unreadable as the case unfolded. He showed little emotion, even when the most harrowing details of Lena's death were presented. It was as though he had become numb to the enormity of his actions. But for Lena's family, and for many in the courtroom, the horror of the crime was all too real. In the end, the jury deliberated for hours. Despite the defense's attempts to explain David's emotional state, the overwhelming brutality of the murder could not be ignored. After several tense hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. David Carter's conviction sent shockwaves through the community. The man once regarded as an upstanding citizen was now a convicted murderer facing a life sentence. The courtroom, once filled with the hopes of a fair trial, now reverberated with the somber weight of justice served, though it could never truly bring back Lena Moore. The trial of David Carter left the Houston community in a state of stunned disbelief. Lena Moore's brutal murder had been a tragedy too unfathomable to fully process, and now the conviction of David, the man who had once been her partner, seemed to leave everyone questioning the nature of love, trust, and betrayal. The crime scene, the trial, and the verdict all underscored the tragic ending of what had once seemed like a perfect life. For Lena's family and friends, the aftermath of her death was a bitter reality they could never reconcile. The woman they had known, vibrant, kind, and full of life, was gone. And in her place, the legacy of violence had left a scar that no amount of justice could heal. The emotional toll of her murder was overwhelming for those who had loved her. Many questioned how David, a man they had all trusted, could have committed such an act of unfathomable brutality. But beneath the anger, the grief was palpable, a loss that would forever haunt them. The public's reaction was swift and far-reaching. The case, with its elements of emotional distress, societal secrecy, and the tragic death of a beloved member of the community, sparked a nationwide conversation. It became more than just a local tragedy. It was a story that resonated deeply with the struggles faced by transgender individuals and their relationships with the world around them. The secrecy surrounding Lena's past and the eventual unraveling of that secret highlighted the very real dangers of hiding one's truth in a world where fear and shame often outweighed acceptance. Lena's story became a focal point for the growing movement advocating for transgender rights and awareness. Social media platforms, buzzing with outrage and sorrow, became a space for activists to rally around her memory. Hashtags like Justice for Lena and Love is Love began trending as more people shared their own experiences of transgender discrimination and violence. The case became a grim reminder of the sometimes devastating consequences of fear and rejection, not only from society, but from those closest to us. At the heart of this public discussion was the question of trust. How could Lena, so deeply in love with David, have kept such a significant part of her identity a secret? And how could David, who professed his love for her, have reacted so violently to a truth that had the potential to alter their relationship, but not destroy it? The tension between truth and secrecy, love and betrayal became the central theme of public discourse. This case also raised unsettling questions about the intersections of race, gender, and violence. Lena, a Black transgender woman, was one of many victims whose lives had been cut short by violence fueled by intolerance. Advocacy groups and activists pointed to the deep-rooted prejudices faced by transgender people, especially transgender women of color, and how these prejudices too often led to tragic outcomes. For many, Lena's death underscored the reality of how transgender individuals, particularly those in marginalized communities, faced an uphill battle for acceptance, respect, and safety. The shockwaves from the case rippled through the transgender community and beyond, amplifying calls for change and understanding. The outpouring of support for Lena's memory from both the transgender community and allies underscored the importance of visibility and representation in the ongoing fight for equality. Lena's death, while a heartbreaking tragedy, became a catalyst for conversations that needed to be had. Conversations about love, identity, secrecy, and the devastating consequences of violence. Lena Moore's tragic death left a profound void in the lives of those who knew and loved her. But her story, though one of unspeakable loss, became a symbol for something much larger than herself. In the wake of her murder, her legacy transcended the devastating events that led to her untimely death. Instead, it sparked a broader dialogue that echoed far beyond Houston and resonated with communities across the nation and even the world. For Lena's family, the loss was not just personal, but a profound reminder of the systemic challenges faced by transgender individuals, particularly Black transgender women. Her mother, who had always supported her transition, was left to grapple with the harsh reality of a society that had never fully embraced Lena for who she truly was. The grief was compounded by a sense of helplessness, as if their love for Lena had been rendered powerless by the world's inability to see and accept her. But even in their sorrow, Lena's family was determined to honor her memory by using her story as a beacon for the fight against transgender violence and discrimination. Lena's legacy soon became a rallying cry for advocacy groups. The hashtag #JusticeForLena was adopted by activists, and social media became flooded with messages of solidarity, remembering her not just for the manner in which she died, but for the life she had lived before her tragic end. Organizations advocating for transgender rights, particularly those focusing on the safety of transgender women of color, seized upon her story as a catalyst for social change. The case underscored the need for increased education on transgender issues, the dangers of secrecy in relationships, and the importance of understanding the intersections of race, gender, and violence. Lena's death also spurred public reflection on the way society handles identity and secrecy. It was a stark reminder of the pressures placed on transgender individuals to hide parts of themselves in order to gain acceptance, and the often devastating consequences when those secrets are revealed in the wrong way. Her story became a symbol for the ongoing struggle for authenticity and acceptance in relationships, and how fear of rejection could lead to life-altering and tragic decisions. David Carter's conviction, while bringing a measure of justice, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The violence, the trauma, and the senselessness of it all left a lasting scar on the community. But as the years passed, Lena's legacy continued to inspire change. Her story became part of a larger conversation about how to better protect and support transgender individuals, particularly those in marginalized communities. A memorial fund was established in Lena's name, dedicated to helping transgender individuals access mental health resources, legal support, and medical care. The fund's founders, including members of Lena's family and local advocacy groups, hoped to offer some solace in the wake of the pain and loss they had all endured. It became a tool for empowerment, a way to honor Lena's life by ensuring that future generations of transgender individuals could live freely and openly without fear of violence or retribution. Despite the sorrow that had defined Lena's final days, her story also embodied resilience and strength. In a world that had too often turned a blind eye to transgender violence, Lena became a symbol of the courage it took to live authentically. Her legacy, though born from tragedy, was one of inspiration. It became a beacon for those who still struggle to live openly and safely, and a reminder to society of the work that still needed to be done to protect the most vulnerable among us. Lena Moore's life was cut short, but the ripples of her existence continued to reverberate across generations. Her story lived on in the hearts of those who fought for justice, equality, and acceptance. It was a story of a woman who, in the end, became more than a victim. She became a force for change, a symbol of the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect for all people, regardless of their gender identity. After the verdict was rendered, David Carter, once a well-respected figure in his community, was forced to face the overwhelming consequences of his actions. His life, as he had known it, was irreversibly shattered. No longer the calm, hardworking man he had been before Lena's death, David was now a convicted murderer, locked away in a prison cell, separated from the life he had once built. The transformation from a man who had been viewed as a reliable, steady presence in the lives of his friends, family, and co-workers, to someone who would forever be associated with one of the most brutal crimes the city had witnessed, was staggering. David's personal journey, however, was just beginning. The emotional and psychological toll of the crime was far from over, and the man who had stood stoically in court throughout the trial would soon face the grim reality of his actions in the quiet solitude of prison life. Behind the bars of his prison cell, David was forced to confront the overwhelming guilt and remorse that consumed him. The man who had once believed himself incapable of such violence now had to live with the knowledge that he had brutally taken the life of the woman he had once loved. His guilt was a constant presence, haunting him at every moment. Every sound in the prison, every visit from a guard or fellow inmate reminded him of the life he had destroyed. The silence in his cell was deafening, and the weight of what he had done pressed down on him in ways that were both physical and emotional. He would spend hours lying awake at night, staring at the concrete walls of his cell, unable to escape the images of the crime, the way Lena's life had been ripped from her, the brutal act that he could never take back. In some ways, it was as though his own life had died along with hers. Though he was not given to public displays of emotion, those who visited him in prison noticed subtle changes in him over time. The calm, collected man who had stood trial without flinching now appeared more withdrawn, his once confident posture now slouched and defeated. His eyes, once bright and determined, were now dull and filled with regret. David had been transformed, not just by the brutality of the crime, but by the crushing weight of the reality of his actions. As the years went on, David's emotional state became a subject of much discussion among those who had followed the case. Some believed that he was consumed by remorse, struggling daily with the enormity of what he had done. Others, however, saw him as a man who had lost everything: his family, his freedom, and his own sense of self. His identity had been irrevocably altered by the crime, and the man who had once been an embodiment of stability and normalcy was now a broken man, isolated and haunted by the violence he had committed. In prison, David's journey toward redemption, if it could be called that, was slow and painful. He would attend therapy sessions, seeking ways to understand the overwhelming rage that had overtaken him in that fateful moment. He would write letters of apology to Lena's family, though he knew that no words could ever undo the harm he had caused. Still, there was something in the act of trying to make amends, even if he could never truly make up for what he had done, that seemed to keep him tethered to any shred of hope. But even as David struggled with his inner demons, his past could never be fully erased. He had committed a crime too monstrous to be easily forgotten. The public's view of him was one of deep disdain, and his transformation from a beloved figure to a cold-blooded murderer left scars on the community as well. While some felt sympathy for him in his state of deep remorse, others viewed him as irredeemable, a man who, no matter how much he suffered, had destroyed someone else's life in the most horrific way. David Carter, once a man with a future, now had nothing. His story became one of loss, not just the loss of his freedom, but the loss of his humanity in the eyes of those who once trusted him. His state was one of ongoing punishment, not only through the legal system, but also through the unrelenting self-condemnation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man he had once been was gone, replaced by a person who would forever be remembered for the unforgivable act that had taken Lena's life. And no matter how much he changed in the years that followed, he would always be marked by the shadow of that moment, a shadow that would never fully fade,